In the furthest reaches of Skyrim, where the aurora paints the night sky in colors that have no earthly names, there once stood a city that defied the very laws of nature itself. Winterhold, crown jewel of the north, where mortals dared to grasp the threads of creation and weave them into spells that could reshape reality. But power, dear listener, always demands its price, and some debts can only be paid in stone and blood and the screams of a dying city. The tale I am about to unfold spans centuries of ambition, tragedy, and the terrible wisdom that comes only through loss. It is the story of the Great Collapse, when the greatest seat of magical learning in all of Tamriel paid the ultimate price for reaching too far into the cosmic void. But this was no accident, no mere natural disaster, as the Nordic histories would have you believe. This was something far more sinister, far more inevitable. Picture, if you will, the morning of the 17th of sun's dusk in the 122nd year of the Fourth Era. The snow fell in perfect silence across the ancient cobblestones of Winterhold, each flake catching the first pale light of dawn like tiny fragments of a shattered star. The city stretched proudly along the northern cliffs, its buildings rising in tiers toward the magnificent college that crowned the highest peak. Smoke curled peacefully from countless chimneys, and the harbor below bustled with merchants and fishermen preparing for another day of prosperity. In the depths of the college's most secure vault, something that should never have been disturbed began to pulse with an inner light. The Eye of Magnus, that terrible artifact of unimaginable power, sensed a disturbance in the cosmic fabric that even the wisest scholars could not comprehend. For you see, the dragon war of ages past had left scars upon reality itself, wounds in the world that had never truly healed. And on this quiet morning, those ancient wounds began to bleed. Young Savos Aren, who would one day become Arch-Mage of the college, walked the frost-covered courtyards with his fellow apprentices, their laughter echoing off the ancient stones. They spoke excitedly of their studies, of mastering new spells, of unlocking the secrets that the masters guarded so jealously. None of them could know that they were living through the final peaceful hours of their world. But in the deepest archives, where dust motes danced in shafts of pale morning light, an ancient scholar named Atma the Chronicler noticed something that chilled his blood more than any Nordic winter. The resonance patterns in the magical crystals that monitored the college's defensive wards had begun to shift in ways that matched descriptions he had read in texts so old they crumbled at a touch. Descriptions of the signs that preceded the great magical catastrophes of history. As the sun climbed higher over Winterhold, casting long shadows across the snow-covered rooftops, Atma hurried through the winding corridors of the college, his footsteps echoing with growing urgency. He carried with him a leather-bound tome that contained prophecies written in the Age of Dragons, warnings of a convergence that would tear the very foundations of reality asunder. But would anyone listen to the fears of an old man who spent his days reading dusty prophecies? The merchants in the harbor loaded their ships with goods, planning voyages to distant lands they would never see. Children played in the snow-filled streets, building fortresses of ice that would outlast the stone buildings around them. And in the great hall of the college, the masters continued their debates about the nature of magic, unaware that the greatest magical catastrophe in Nordic history was already beginning to unfold beneath their feet. For you see, dear listener, the Eye of Magnus had been waiting through centuries of peaceful slumber for the cosmic alignment that would finally allow it to awaken fully. And when that moment came, when the stars moved into the positions foretold by the ancient dragon priests, nothing in all of Tamriel would have the power to stop what was about to be unleashed upon the unsuspecting city of Winterhold. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, you must first understand what Winterhold was in those golden days before the collapse. This was no mere Nordic settlement clinging to the harsh northern coast, but a true marvel of civilization, where the ancient traditions of the Nords had merged with the highest arts of magical learning to create something unprecedented in the long history of Tamriel. The city rose from the harbor in graceful terraces, each level connected by broad stone staircases that had been carved directly from the living rock of the cliffs. The lower districts housed the merchants and craftsmen whose skills had made Winterhold wealthy beyond measure. Here, Nordic smiths worked metals that had been tempered with frost spells, creating weapons and armor that commanded premium prices across the empire. Enchanters plied their trade in workshops where the air itself shimmered with magical energy, and alchemists brewed potions from ingredients gathered in the most dangerous corners of Skyrim. But it was the upper city, climbing toward the college, where Winterhold's true character revealed itself. Grand libraries filled with texts from across Tamriel attracted scholars from every province. The famous Winterhold Museum displayed artifacts that traced the history of Nordic civilization back to the legendary arrival of Ysgramor himself. Comfortable inns with roaring hearths welcomed travelers who came seeking knowledge rather than gold, and the city's famous restaurants served delicacies prepared with magical techniques that enhanced both flavor and nourishment. The College of Winterhold itself stood as the crown jewel of this magnificent city, its towers reaching toward the dancing aurora, like fingers grasping for divine knowledge. Founded in the early years of the First Era by the legendary Arch-Mage Savos, the college had grown over the millennia into the most prestigious magical institution in all of Tamriel. Its great library contained texts that existed nowhere else in the world, including first-hand accounts of the Dragon War, written by those who had fought alongside the ancient heroes. Students came from every corner of the continent to study within its halls. Young Bretons arrived with natural talents for magical theory that amazed even their instructors. Imperial scholars brought organizational skills that helped catalog the college's vast collections. Dunmer refugees from the destruction of Morrowind shared knowledge of Telvanni magical techniques that had been closely guarded secrets for centuries. Even the occasional Altmer would set aside the pride of their race to learn from the Nordic masters who had preserved magical traditions that Somerset Isle had long forgotten. The daily rhythm of life in the college followed patterns that had been established over thousands of years. Before dawn, the apprentices would gather in the Great Hall for morning meditation, their voices joining in ancient chants that helped focus their magical energies for the day ahead. As the sun rose over the Sea of Ghosts, painting the snow-covered courtyards in shades of gold and pink, the serious business of magical education would begin. In the Hall of the Elements, students practiced the fundamental schools of magic under the watchful eyes of master wizards whose knowledge had been accumulated over lifetimes of study. The careful discipline required for destruction magic was balanced by lessons in restoration that taught the sacred responsibility of healing. Illusion classes explored the ethical implications of influencing other minds, while conjuration students learned to summon creatures from other planes with the respect due to sentient beings. The college's laboratories buzzed with constant activity as advanced students worked on research projects that pushed the boundaries of magical knowledge. Some sought to improve upon traditional spell formulas, finding ways to achieve the same effects with less magical energy. Others explored entirely new applications of established principles, leading to innovations that would eventually spread throughout the magical community of Tamriel. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of pre-collapse Winterhold was how seamlessly the magical and mundane worlds coexisted. Nordic fishermen used minor frost spells to preserve their catches on long voyages, while their wives employed clever applications of flame magic to maintain their hearth fires through the harshest winter storms. Children grew up learning simple cantrips alongside their letters and numbers, treating magic as a natural part of life rather than something mysterious and dangerous. The city's prosperity attracted merchants from across the empire, and Winterhold's markets became famous for goods that could only be found there. Specially treated furs that provided protection against both cold and magical attacks. weapons that never dulled because they had been forged with techniques that infused the metal itself with magical properties, books whose pages had been prepared with preservation spells that would keep them readable for centuries. Yet beneath this prosperity and learning, there were those who sensed that change was coming. The old Nordic traditions spoke of cycles, of times when the world itself would be tested by forces beyond mortal comprehension. Ancient prophecies, dismissed by many as the superstitions of a less enlightened age, spoke of signs that careful observers could detect if they knew what to look for. Atma the Chronicler was one such observer. For decades, he had studied the patterns of history, looking for the connections that linked seemingly unrelated events across the centuries. In his private study, high in one of the college's most ancient towers, he maintained detailed records of magical phenomena that others dismissed as random fluctuations. The slight variations in the aurora's colors, the subtle changes in the migration patterns of ice wraiths, the occasional reports of strange dreams shared by multiple people, all of these found their way into his meticulous notes. On that fateful morning of the 17th of sun's dusk, as he hurried through the college corridors with his ancient tome of prophecies, Atma carried with him the accumulated weight of a lifetime spent watching for signs that most scholars considered meaningless. The resonance patterns he had detected in the monitoring crystals matched descriptions that dated back to the Dragon War itself, and he knew with growing certainty that the peaceful days of Winterhold were about to end forever. The first signs of change came not with thunder or earthquake, but with subtle shifts that only the most observant scholars noticed. In the weeks following that crucial morning, when Atma the Chronicler first detected the anomalous resonance patterns, the College of Winterhold began to experience phenomena that would have seemed miraculous to outsiders, but filled the masters with growing unease. Students practicing simple flame spells found their magic responding with unusual vigor, flames burning brighter and hotter than their skill level should have allowed. Apprentices who had struggled for months to maintain even the weakest ward suddenly discovered they could deflect spells that would have challenged advanced practitioners. The college's enchanted training dummies, designed to absorb and dissipate magical energy safely, began to emit a faint luminescence that persisted long after practice sessions had ended. Master Cored Bearclaw, the college's ancient instructor of destruction magic, was among the first to recognize that these improvements came with a price. During an advanced class on frost manipulation, one of his most promising students accidentally created an ice formation so pure and cold that it began to drain heat from the surrounding air at an alarming rate. The entire classroom had to be evacuated when the temperature dropped so rapidly that even the Nordic students began to suffer from exposure. Similar incidents occurred throughout the college with increasing frequency. A conjuration student summoned a familiar that remained corporeal for 3 times the normal duration, putting dangerous strain on both the summoner and the creature itself. An illusion spell designed to create a simple disguise became so convincing that even the caster began to believe in the false identity, requiring intervention from Master Mirabel Ervine to restore the student's proper sense of self. But perhaps most disturbing were the effects observed in the college's extensive magical library. Ancient tomes that had remained stable for centuries began to exhibit strange properties. Texts on fire magic grew warm to the touch, while volumes dealing with frost techniques became uncomfortably cold. Books containing conjuration spells occasionally flipped their own pages, as if invisible hands were browsing through their contents. Most unsettling of all, several manuscripts written in the old dragon language began to emit a barely audible humming sound that seemed to resonate in the bones of anyone who approached them. Arch-Mage Savos Aren called for a gathering of the college's senior masters to discuss these developments. In the comfortable chamber that had hosted such meetings for over 1,000 years, beneath portraits of legendary mages who had shaped the institution's history, the greatest magical minds in Skyrim attempted to make sense of what they were experiencing. Master Feralda, whose expertise in ward magic was renowned throughout the Empire, presented her observations with characteristic precision. The protective barriers that surrounded the college, spells that had been maintained through unbroken tradition since the days of Shalador himself, were showing signs of instability. Not weakness, she emphasized, but rather a kind of hyperactivity that suggested they were responding to some external influence that the monitoring systems could not identify. Tolfdir, the elderly master, whose knowledge of alteration magic spanned nearly 2 centuries of study, shared his own troubling discoveries. The fundamental laws that governed magical transformation seemed to be fluctuating in ways that defied all established theory. Spells that should have produced predictable results were yielding variations that suggested reality itself had become more malleable, more responsive to magical influence than it had any right to be. As the masters shared their findings, a pattern began to emerge that filled them with growing apprehension. The college was not simply experiencing random magical surges, but rather systematic changes that affected every school of magic simultaneously. Whatever force was causing these phenomena operated on a scale so vast that it could influence the fundamental nature of magical energy itself. Atma the Chronicler, invited to the meeting because of his unique expertise in historical patterns, presented evidence that connected their current situation to similar events from the distant past. His ancient texts described periods of magical instability that had preceded some of the most catastrophic events in Tamriel's history. The War of the First Council in Morrowind had been preceded by months of similar anomalies. The warp in the West, that reality-altering event that had reshaped the political landscape of High Rock and Hammerfell, had begun with magical fluctuations that matched their current observations almost exactly. But most chilling of all were the passages he read from texts that dated back to the Dragon War itself. The ancient chroniclers wrote of a time when magic became wild and unpredictable, when spells took on lives of their own, and the very air crackled with untamed power. They described artifacts of immense power, stirring in their resting places, responding to cosmic forces that mortal minds could barely comprehend. The meeting continued long into the night, as the masters debated possible courses of action. Some advocated for immediate contact with the imperial authorities, arguing that phenomena of this magnitude required the attention of the Empire's most skilled battle mages. Others insisted that the college should handle the situation internally, fearing that outside interference might make the instability worse. Young Ancano, the Thalmor advisor, whose presence at the college had always been a source of subtle tension, listened to these discussions with particular interest. His knowledge of Ulmer magical theory provided insights that the Nordic masters found both valuable and unsettling. He spoke of ancient Ulmeri texts that describe periods when the barriers between the mortal realm and Aetherius grew thin, allowing raw magical energy to flow into Nirn in unprecedented quantities. As dawn approached and the meeting finally concluded, each master left with specific assignments designed to monitor and document the continuing changes. New procedures were established for magical instruction, with additional safety measures that reflected the unpredictable nature of their current environment. The college's most sensitive experiments were postponed indefinitely, and access to the most powerful artifacts in their collection was restricted to only the most senior faculty members. But even as these precautions were implemented, all present knew that they were treating symptoms rather than addressing the underlying cause. Something fundamental was changing in the nature of magic itself, and the College of Winterhold found itself at the center of forces that none of them truly understood. In his private chambers as the aurora danced with unusual intensity across the pre-dawn sky, Atma the Chronicler continued his research with growing urgency. The prophecies he studied spoke of a convergence, a moment when the accumulated power of ages would be released in a single catastrophic event. The signs were all present, the cosmic conditions were aligning, and deep in the most secure vaults of the college, something ancient and terrible was beginning to awaken from its long slumber. The peaceful days of scholarly routine were ending, and though none yet suspected the true magnitude of what was approaching, the wise among them began to prepare for changes that would reshape not just the college, but the entire northern coast of Skyrim. The investigation that followed the emergency gathering of the college masters marked the beginning of the most intensive research project in the institution's long history. Teams of scholars worked around the clock, their efforts coordinated with a precision that would have impressed even the most methodical imperial bureaucrats. Yet as their understanding deepened, so too did their realization that they were confronting something far beyond the scope of conventional magical theory. Master Sergius Turians, the college's expert enchanter, led the effort to analyze the changes occurring in magical items throughout the facility. His workshop, normally a place of quiet concentration where he crafted the specialized tools needed for advanced magical instruction, had been transformed into something resembling a battlefield medical station. Tables groaned under the weight of enchanted weapons, scrolls, staves, and amulets, all exhibiting properties that defied their original design specifications. A simple steel sword that had been enchanted with a basic fire spell now burned with flames so intense that they had to store it in a specially prepared container lined with frost salts. A student's practice staff, originally charged with a minor shock spell, now crackled with electrical energy powerful enough to illuminate an entire room. Most disturbing of all was an ancient amulet from the college's collection, a piece that had remained magically inert for over 3 centuries, which had suddenly begun to emit a pulsing light that seemed to respond to the emotional state of anyone who approached it. Sergius documented each anomaly with meticulous care, but his scientific training could not fully suppress the growing dread that accompanied each new discovery. The patterns he observed suggested that magical energy itself was being amplified by some external source, but the nature of that source remained frustratingly elusive. Traditional divination spells, which should have revealed the origin of such massive magical disturbances, returned only confused images and contradictory information. Meanwhile, in the college's great library, a different kind of investigation was underway. Horag Groshub, the Orsimer librarian, whose knowledge of the collection surpassed that of scholars who had studied there for decades, organized teams of researchers to examine every text that might contain relevant information. The normally quiet halls of learning buzzed with urgent activity as scribes copied passages from books too fragile to be handled repeatedly, while translation experts worked to decode manuscripts written in archaic dialects of the dragon language. The most significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Finis Gester, the college's master of conjuration, had been investigating reports that summoned creatures were behaving strangely when a chance observation led him to a startling realization. The Daedra and other extraplanar beings that responded to conjuration spells were not simply more powerful than usual, they were also more communicative, more willing to share information about conditions in their native realms. Through careful questioning of a particularly intelligent flame Atronach, Finis learned that the planes of oblivion themselves were experiencing disturbances. The creature, speaking in the crackling voice that characterized its kind, described currents of energy flowing through dimensions that normally existed in perfect isolation from one another. These currents, it explained in terms that strained the limits of mortal comprehension, originated from somewhere within the physical realm of Nirn itself. This revelation prompted Arch-Mage Savos Aren to authorize access to the college's most restricted collection, texts and artifacts that were normally studied only by masters of proven wisdom and restraint. Among these forbidden materials was a collection of writings attributed to the legendary Arch-Mage Shalador himself, notes and theories that had been deemed too dangerous for general circulation. Shalador's writings, penned in his distinctive hand over 4,000 years earlier, contained references to what he termed focal points of creation, locations where the fundamental forces that shaped reality were concentrated to an unusual degree. He theorized that such places could serve as conduits for energies that existed beyond the normal boundaries of magical manipulation, but warned that disturbing these focal points could have consequences that would ripple across time itself. The description of one particular focal point sent chills through everyone who read it. Shalidor wrote of an artifact of immense power, a crystalline sphere that contained what he described as a fragment of the architect's blueprint, a piece of the fundamental design that governed the structure of reality. This artifact, according to his notes, had been discovered during the construction of the college itself, buried deep within the bedrock of the cliff upon which the institution was built. The implications were staggering. If Shalidor's writings were accurate, the College of Winterhold had been constructed directly above one of the most powerful magical artifacts ever discovered. For over 4 millennia, the scholars who worked and studied within its walls had been unknowingly walking above a source of power that could reshape the world itself. An expedition was immediately organized to investigate the deepest levels of the college, areas that had been sealed off for centuries and were now accessible only through maintenance tunnels that most current residents didn't even know existed. Led by Tolfdir, whose expertise in alteration magic made him uniquely qualified to deal with whatever protective measures might still be active, the team made their way through passages carved from the living rock. The journey downward revealed layer upon layer of the college's history. They passed through chambers that had been built during different eras of expansion, each reflecting the architectural preferences and magical techniques of its time. Protective wards that had been established by long-dead masters still hummed with power, their energy signatures creating a complex pattern that spoke of centuries of accumulated magical workings. Finally, after hours of careful descent, they reached a chamber that matched Shalidor's descriptions exactly. The room was perfectly circular, its walls covered with inscriptions in the dragon language that seemed to shift and flow when observed directly. At the center of the chamber, resting on a pedestal of what appeared to be crystallized starlight, was an orb of impossible beauty and terrible power. The Eye of Magnus, for that was undoubtedly what they had found, defied every attempt at description. Its surface seemed to contain entire galaxies, swirling patterns of light and energy that suggested depths far greater than its physical dimensions should have allowed. As the expedition members watched in awe and growing terror, the artifact pulsed with a rhythm that matched the beating of their own hearts, as if it were somehow synchronized with the life force of every being that approached it. Tolfdir, drawing upon decades of experience with dangerous magical phenomena, immediately recognized the signs of an artifact in the process of awakening. The eye was not simply displaying its power, it was actively drawing energy from its surroundings, using the magical saturation of the college itself as fuel for some incomprehensible purpose. The fluctuations they had been observing throughout the facility were not random surges, but rather the systematic drainage of power into this single point of impossible concentration. As the team retreated from the chamber, sealing it with every protective ward they could devise, the terrible truth began to emerge. The College of Winterhold had not been built to house scholars and preserve knowledge, though it had served those purposes admirably for millennia. It had been constructed as a containment facility, designed to keep the Eye of Magnus safely dormant through the accumulated will and wisdom of generations of mages. But something had changed. Some cosmic alignment or ancient trigger had been activated, and the Eye was awakening from its long slumber. The question that haunted every member of the expedition was simple and terrifying. What would happen when it fully awakened, and did they have any power to stop it? The discovery of the Eye of Magnus transformed the College of Winterhold from a seat of learning into something resembling a fortress preparing for siege. Yet, this was no ordinary enemy they faced, no army that could be repelled with sword and spell. The threat came from within their very foundations, from an artifact whose power dwarfed anything in recorded history. Arch-Mage Savos Aren convened an emergency council that included not only the college masters, but also representatives from other magical institutions across Tamriel. Urgent messages, carried by the swiftest courier spells available, reached the Arcane University in the Imperial City, the magical colleges of High Rock, and even the mysterious Psijic order on their hidden island of Thu'um. The responses that came back painted a picture of growing alarm throughout the scholarly community. From Cyrodiil came reports that the Guild of Mages had detected massive disturbances in the flow of magical energy across the continent. Their most sensitive instruments registered fluctuations originating from a point in northern Skyrim that corresponded exactly with Winterhold's location. The disturbances were so powerful that they were affecting magical research as far south as Leawin, where a simple transmutation experiment had accidentally converted an entire laboratory's worth of iron into a previously unknown crystalline substance. The Bretons of High Rock, whose understanding of magical theory rivaled even that of the Altmer, sent detailed analyses that confirmed the college's worst fears. Their calculations suggested that the energy being released by the Eye of Magnus was not simply magical in nature, but represented something far more fundamental. They theorized that the artifact was tapping into the same forces that had been used in the creation of Nirn itself, drawing power from the very foundation stones of reality. But it was the response from the Psijic order that truly demonstrated the magnitude of what they faced. The mysterious mages of Thu'um, who rarely involved themselves in the affairs of other magical institutions, sent a delegation with unprecedented speed. Their message was brief but chilling. The awakening of the Eye represented a threat not just to Skyrim or even Tamriel, but to the fundamental stability of the mortal realm itself. The Psijic delegation, led by the ancient Arch-Mage Quaranir, arrived at Winterhold through means that defied conventional understanding of magical travel. One moment the aurora-lit courtyard was empty. The next it contained 5 figures whose very presence seemed to cause reality to shift and flow around them. Their robes bore no decoration save for intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly, designs that suggested geometric relationships beyond mortal comprehension. Quaranir himself appeared ageless in the way that only the most powerful mages could achieve, his eyes holding depth that spoke of centuries spent studying forces that lesser minds could not safely contemplate. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated in the bones of his listeners, as if his words were tuned to frequencies that existed outside normal human perception. The knowledge he shared with the assembled college masters came from sources that predated the establishment of any known civilization. According to Psijic lore, the Eye of Magnus was one of several artifacts created during the earliest days of creation, when the gods themselves walked among mortals and the laws that governed reality were still being written. These artifacts, known collectively as the tools of creation, possessed power that could literally reshape the fundamental nature of existence. Most of these artifacts had been lost or destroyed during the great conflicts that marked the end of the Dawn era. But a few had survived, hidden away in places where their influence could be contained. The Eye of Magnus had been discovered by the ancient Nords during their expansion into northern Skyrim, and its presence had been the true reason for establishing the College of Winterhold in that specific location. For over 4,000 years, the combined will and magical expertise of generations of scholars had served to keep the Eye dormant. The very structure of the college, from its fundamental architecture to the positioning of its towers, had been designed according to principles that channeled and contained the artifact's power. Every tradition of the institution, from the daily meditation rituals to the specific methods used for magical instruction, served the dual purpose of education and containment. But the cosmic forces that had originally triggered the Eye's creation were once again coming into alignment. The Dragon War of the Merethic era had left scars in the fabric of reality that was still healing, and certain astronomical phenomena occurred only once every several thousand years. When these conditions converged, as they were doing now, the Eye would inevitably awaken, regardless of any mortal efforts to prevent it. Quaranir explained that the Psijic order had been monitoring these cosmic cycles for millennia, preparing for the moment when intervention would become necessary. Their island of Thu'um existed partially outside normal time and space, allowing them to observe events from a perspective that revealed patterns invisible to conventional study. They had foreseen this awakening and had spent centuries preparing for the crisis that would follow. The solutions they offered were as terrifying as they were necessary. The Eye of Magnus could not be destroyed by any known means, nor could its awakening be prevented. The only option was to remove it from Nirn entirely, transporting it to a location where its power could not affect the mortal realm. But such a procedure would require magical workings of unprecedented scale and complexity, with consequences that could not be fully predicted. The most promising approach involved using the Eye's own power against itself, channeling its energy through a carefully constructed ritual circle that would open a gateway to a pocket dimension specially prepared to contain it. This pocket realm would be sealed off from normal space and time, preventing the artifact from influencing events in the mortal world. However, the magical forces required for such an undertaking would inevitably affect the surrounding area in ways that could not be controlled or contained. As the Psijic delegation worked with the college masters to refine their plans, disturbing reports continued to arrive from throughout northern Skyrim. Fishing villages along the coast reported unusual behavior in sea life, with normally docile creatures becoming aggressive and displaying intelligence far beyond their natural capacity. Ice formations along the shoreline had begun to take on geometric patterns that suggested artificial origin, while the aurora itself had begun to pulse in rhythms that corresponded to the Eye's energy fluctuations. Most troubling of all were the effects on the human population of Winterhold itself. Citizens who had lived their entire lives in proximity to the college began to display sensitivity to magical phenomena that they had never possessed before. Children who had shown no aptitude for magic suddenly found themselves able to perform simple spells without training, while adults reported dreams filled with visions of vast cosmic machinery and incomprehensible mathematical relationships. The city's government, led by Jarl Kori, who had ruled Winterhold for over 2 decades, struggled to maintain order as panic began to spread among the population. Official proclamations spoke of temporary magical research being conducted at the college, but the citizens could see the constant stream of mages arriving from across Tamriel, and the aurora's unnatural behavior was visible to anyone who looked up at the night sky. As preparations for the great ritual continued, a sense of urgency permeated every aspect of life in Winterhold. The college's students were evacuated to other institutions, their educations interrupted by forces beyond anyone's control. The faculty worked in shifts around the clock, preparing materials and refining techniques that would be needed for the most ambitious magical undertaking in recorded history. Yet even as they labored to save their world from cosmic catastrophe, all involved knew that success would come at a terrible price. The ritual required to remove the Eye of Magnus would unleash forces that could not be contained within the college walls. The question that haunted every participant was not whether they could succeed in their goal, but whether anything of Winterhold would survive the attempt. In the depths of the college's most ancient archives, where scrolls bearing the seal of the first Nordic kings crumbled at the slightest touch, scholars worked frantically to uncover the connections between their current crisis and the legendary conflicts of the past. The Psijic delegation had spoken of cosmic cycles and recurring patterns, but the specific nature of these connections remained frustratingly elusive until a discovery made by the most unlikely of researchers changed everything. Feralda the Nord, whose expertise lay in protective magic rather than historical research, had been assigned to examine ward spells that dated back to the college's earliest days. She hoped to find techniques that might be adapted to contain the Eye's growing influence, but what she discovered instead was far more significant. Hidden within the mathematical formulas that defined these ancient protections were references to specific astronomical configurations that corresponded exactly to the celestial events occurring at the time of the Dragon War. The implications of this discovery sent shockwaves through the research teams. If the ward spells had been designed with knowledge of these cosmic cycles, it suggested that the ancient mages who established the college understood far more about the Eye of Magnus than anyone had previously suspected. They had not simply stumbled upon the artifact and built around it, but had deliberately chosen to construct their institution during a period when the Eye's power was at its lowest ebb. This revelation prompted a complete re-examination of the college's historical records, with teams of scholars working to decode references that had previously been dismissed as metaphorical language or religious symbolism. What emerged was a picture of ancient Nordic society that differed dramatically from the popular conception of primitive barbarians wielding crude weapons against overwhelming draconic might. The true history of the Dragon War, as revealed by these newly understood texts, was far more complex than the simplified versions taught to Nordic children. Yes, the ancient Nords had fought against the dragons and their dragon priest allies, but the conflict had been as much about magical philosophy as territorial control. The dragons represented a cosmological viewpoint that saw mortals as insignificant components in vast cosmic machinery, while the Nordic heroes championed the idea that mortal will could shape the fundamental nature of reality itself. At the center of this philosophical conflict stood figures whose names had become legend, but whose true achievements had been forgotten even by their own descendants. Ysgramor the Harbinger had not simply led his people to victory through superior tactics and courage, but had wielded magical knowledge that allowed him to manipulate the same cosmic forces that the dragons themselves drew upon. The famous companions who fought beside him were not merely skilled warriors, but mages whose understanding of reality-shaping magic rivaled that of the dragon priests themselves. Most significant of all was the role played by the Greybeards and their Thu'um, the voice that could reshape reality through spoken word. The texts revealed that the Thu'um was not simply a form of sonic magic, but a technique for directly interfacing with the fundamental frequencies that govern the structure of existence. When a master of the voice spoke a word of power, they were literally rewriting the rules that determined how reality functioned in their immediate vicinity. The connection to the Eye of Magnus became clear when scholars discovered references to a great working performed during the final stages of the Dragon War. This ritual, conducted by a combined force of Nordic heroes and reformed dragon priests who had turned against their draconic masters, had used the Thu'um to create what the texts described as a lock upon the foundations of the world. The mathematical descriptions of this working matched the energy patterns currently being observed around the Eye with terrifying precision. The ancient Nords had known about the Eye's existence and had deliberately created a magical containment system that would keep it dormant for thousands of years. The Dragon War had not ended with the simple defeat of the dragons, but with a cosmic-scale spell that had locked away one of the most powerful artifacts ever created. The Thu'um masters had literally spoken new laws of reality into existence, laws that would prevent the Eye from awakening until the cosmic cycles brought about conditions that would override their ancient command. But the texts also contained warnings that chilled the blood of every scholar who read them. The Nordic heroes who had performed this great working understood that their solution was temporary at best. They wrote of future ages when the cosmic forces would align once again, when the lock they had placed upon the Eye would weaken and eventually fail. They had hoped that future generations would be wiser and more powerful than themselves, capable of finding a permanent solution to the threat that the Eye represented. The irony was not lost on the scholars who uncovered these warnings. The College of Winterhold, built to serve as both a center of learning and a monitoring station for the dormant Eye, had indeed produced generations of mages whose knowledge surpassed that of their ancient predecessors. Yet this very accumulation of magical knowledge and power had created the conditions necessary for the Eye's awakening. The intense concentration of magical energy within the college's walls had gradually worn away at the ancient containment, like water slowly eroding even the strongest stone. Ulrich Grushub, whose Orcish heritage gave him a different perspective on Nordic history than his human colleagues, made perhaps the most disturbing discovery of all. Deep within a collection of dragon priest writings that had been captured during the ancient war, he found references to the true purpose of the Eye of Magnus. According to these texts, the artifact was not simply a repository of power, but a tool designed for a specific cosmic function. The Eye, according to the dragon priests, was one of several mechanisms created by the gods during the earliest days of creation to serve as regulatory devices for the fundamental forces that governed reality. Like the gears in a vast cosmic clockwork, these artifacts were meant to activate periodically to make adjustments in the basic laws that determined how magic, time, space, and matter interacted with one another. The dragon priests had worshipped these periodic adjustments as divine interventions, believing that they represented the gods' ongoing involvement in the maintenance of creation. The Nordic heroes, however, had seen them as threats to mortal independence, cosmic resets that would undo the achievements of mortal civilization and return the world to a more primitive state. The Dragon War had been fought not just over territory or power, but over the fundamental question of whether mortals had the right to resist divine interference in their affairs. The implications for their current situation were staggering. If the ancient texts were accurate, the Eye of Magnus was not malfunctioning or being influenced by outside forces, but was simply preparing to perform its intended function. The cosmic alignment that was triggering its awakening was not an accident, but a deliberately designed mechanism that ensured the artifact would activate at precisely the right moment to carry out its cosmic purpose. This revelation transformed the entire nature of their crisis. They were not dealing with a magical catastrophe that could be solved through clever spellwork or superior knowledge, but with a fundamental conflict between mortal ambition and cosmic design. The Eye's awakening represented a test of whether mortal civilization had progressed far enough to resist the kind of divine intervention that had shaped the world during its earliest ages. The ancient Nordic heroes had passed this test through courage and sacrifice, using their mastery of the Thu'um to temporarily override cosmic law itself. But their solution had been designed to give future generations time to develop their own response to the challenge. The scholars of Winterhold now found themselves called upon to prove that mortal knowledge and determination could permanently resolve the tension between cosmic design and mortal independence. As this understanding spread through the research teams, it became clear that their task was far more significant than simply preventing a magical disaster. They were being asked to complete the work begun by their legendary predecessors to find a permanent solution to one of the fundamental challenges that had shaped the history of Tamriel since the earliest days of creation. The weight of this responsibility was almost overwhelming, but it also provided a sense of purpose that transcended personal survival. They were not simply trying to save their city or their institution, but fighting for the principle that mortal beings had the right to shape their own destiny without interference from cosmic forces beyond their control. Yet even as they embraced this noble purpose, all involved knew that the price of failure would be measured not in individual lives, but in the fate of civilizations yet unborn. As the scholars of Winterhold delved deeper into the mysteries surrounding the Eye of Magnus, the artifact itself began to respond to their attention in ways that defied every principle of magical theory they had ever studied. The chamber that housed the Eye, sealed behind wards that had been strengthened by the combined efforts of college masters and Psijic mages, had become a focal point for phenomena that rippled outward through the entire structure of reality in northern Skyrim. Master Tolfdir, whose expertise in alteration magic had made him the primary observer of the Eye's awakening process, established a monitoring station in the tunnels above the sealed chamber. From this vantage point, protected by layers of protective spells that required constant maintenance, he documented changes that challenged his understanding of how magical artifacts were supposed to function. The Eye did not simply emit energy in the random surges typical of most powerful items, but pulsed with rhythms that suggested conscious intention. The patterns Tolfdir recorded matched mathematical sequences that appeared throughout the natural world, from the spiral arrangements of leaves on growing plants to the orbital mechanics that governed the movement of celestial bodies. It was as if the eye was attempting to synchronize itself with the fundamental harmonics that underlied all existence, gradually bringing its own frequency into alignment with the cosmic forces that shaped reality at its most basic level. But perhaps most unsettling was the way the eye seemed to respond to the emotional states of those who approached its chamber. When Tolfdir observed it during periods of calm scholarly detachment, the artifact's glow remained steady and its energy output followed predictable cycles. However, when his observations were motivated by fear or curiosity or wonder, the eye's behavior became correspondingly more dynamic, as if it was feeding off the psychological energy of its observers. This discovery led to controlled experiments that revealed the true scope of the eye's influence. Volunteers from among the college faculty, protected by every ward spell known to Nordic magical tradition, approached the chamber while maintaining specific emotional states. The results were both fascinating and terrifying. Positive emotions like wonder, hope, and determination caused the eye to emit a warm, golden light that seemed to enhance the magical abilities of everyone in the vicinity. Negative emotions like fear, anger, or despair triggered displays of cold, blue-white energy that left observers feeling drained and disoriented. The Psijic delegation, led by Arch-Mage Aren, observed these experiments with expressions that gradually shifted from scholarly interest to profound concern. According to their ancient knowledge, artifacts that responded to emotional input represented a category of magical item that existed at the very boundary between the material and spiritual realms. Such items did not simply contain power, but served as conduits for forces that transcended the normal limitations of physical existence. Aren explained that the Eye of Magnus was what Psijic theory classified as a sympathetic resonator, an artifact that could establish connections across vast distances of space and time with other objects or beings that shared similar energy patterns. The emotional responses they had observed were not random reactions, but evidence that the eye was actively seeking to establish such connections with conscious beings who possessed sufficient magical sensitivity to serve as anchor points for its influence. The implications were staggering. If the eye was indeed seeking to establish sympathetic connections with powerful mages, it might be attempting to create a network of linked consciousnesses that could serve its cosmic purpose. Every interaction with the artifact, no matter how carefully controlled, risked creating exactly the kind of connection that would allow it to influence events far beyond the confines of its chamber. This revelation prompted immediate changes in the research protocols. Direct observation of the eye was limited to the most experienced masters, and even they were required to work in shifts that prevented prolonged exposure to its influence. Protective rituals were established that would sever any sympathetic connections that might form, though the effectiveness of these measures remained uncertain given the unprecedented nature of the threat they faced. Meanwhile, the effects of the eye's awakening continued to spread throughout Winterhold and the surrounding region. The city's magical practitioners, from the learned masters of the college to the humble hedge wizards who served the common folk, began to report experiences that suggested their abilities were being enhanced by proximity to the artifact. Simple healing spells became more effective, minor enchantments lasted longer than they should have, and even non-mages occasionally found themselves able to perform small magical feats that would normally have been impossible. The enhancement of magical abilities might have been welcomed under normal circumstances, but the scholars recognized it as evidence that the eye's influence was spreading beyond the containment measures they had established. If common citizens were being affected by the artifact's power, it meant that their protective wards were not as effective as they had hoped. The eye was somehow reaching through layers of magical protection to touch the minds and souls of everyone in the region. Reports began to arrive from beyond Winterhold itself, carried by travelers and messengers who spoke of strange occurrences throughout northern Skyrim. Farmers reported that their crops were growing with unusual vigor, producing harvests that were larger and more nutritious than anything they had achieved before. Hunters spoke of animals displaying intelligence and behavior patterns that seemed almost human in their complexity. Most disturbing of all were accounts of aurora displays that appeared during daylight hours, visible against the pale winter sky, like ghostly reminders of forces beyond mortal comprehension. The college's divination specialists, working with scrying techniques that had been refined over centuries of practice, attempted to map the full extent of the eye's influence. What they discovered confirmed their worst fears. The artifact's power was not spreading randomly, but following specific patterns that corresponded to ancient ley lines that had been established during the earliest ages of Nordic settlement. These mystical pathways, invisible to normal sight but detectable through careful magical analysis, formed a network that connected every major population center in northern Skyrim. If the Eye continued to strengthen its connection to this network, it would eventually be able to influence events throughout the entire northern region of the province. The enhanced magical abilities that citizens of Winterhold were experiencing represented only the beginning of changes that could ultimately transform the very nature of Nordic society. The artifact was not simply awakening, but was actively working to reshape the human population into something that could better serve its cosmic purpose. This understanding prompted emergency consultations with authorities throughout Skyrim and beyond. Messages were dispatched to Jarl Elisif in Solitude, to the imperial authorities in Cyrodiil, and even to the mysterious Greybeards on their mountain stronghold of High Hrothgar. The responses that came back painted a picture of growing alarm throughout the political and religious establishments of northern Tamriel. The Greybeards, whose mastery of the Thu'um gave them unique insight into cosmic forces, sent a delegation of their most skilled practitioners to Winterhold. These masters of the voice, whose understanding of reality-shaping magic dated back to the legendary heroes of the Dragon War, confirmed that the current crisis represented a direct continuation of the conflicts that had shaped Nordic history for thousands of years. According to Greybeard teachings, the Thu'um itself was a form of sympathetic resonance, a technique that allowed mortal voices to harmonize with the fundamental frequencies that govern the structure of existence. The ancient heroes who had first learned this art had discovered that reality could be reshaped through conscious intent expressed with sufficient knowledge and will. The Eye of Magnus represented a similar principle operating on a cosmic scale, an artifact that could impose its will upon reality through pure sympathetic resonance. The arrival of the Greybeards marked a turning point in the college's approach to the crisis. No longer could they treat the Eye's awakening as simply a magical problem to be solved through scholarly research and careful application of established techniques. They were dealing with forces that operated according to principles that transcended conventional magical theory, forces that could only be countered by beings who possessed similar cosmic authority. As preparations began for rituals that would combine the knowledge of the college, the wisdom of the Psijic order, and the reality-shaping power of the Thu'um, all involved understood that they were approaching the climactic phase of their struggle against the Eye of Magnus. The artifact had revealed its true nature as a cosmic mechanism designed to reshape reality according to divine will, and the only hope for preserving mortal independence lay in proving that mortal knowledge and determination could match the power of the gods themselves. The chamber that housed the Eye continued to pulse with growing intensity, its influence spreading through channels that connected it to every corner of northern Skyrim. Time was running short, and the window of opportunity for effective intervention was closing with each passing day. The scholars of Winterhold, supported by the greatest magical authorities in Tamriel, prepared for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of their city, but the future relationship between mortal civilization and the cosmic forces that had shaped the world since the dawn of creation. The final phase of the Eye's awakening began not with dramatic displays of power, but with subtle changes that only the most sensitive observers initially detected. In the pre-dawn hours of the 4th of Evening Star, Master Feralda noticed that the protective wards surrounding the college had begun to resonate with frequencies that matched the artifact's energy output. This synchronization, which occurred despite every effort to maintain the ward's independence, marked the beginning of the end for the ancient containment systems that had kept the Eye dormant for over 4 millennia. The resonance effect spread rapidly through every defensive spell that surrounded the college, creating a feedback loop that amplified the Eye's influence while simultaneously weakening the barriers designed to contain it. Master Sergius Turians, monitoring the situation from his enchantment workshop, watched in horror as magical items throughout the college began to respond to the Eye's rhythmic pulsing. Enchanted weapons thrummed with barely contained energy, practice staves discharged random bursts of power, and even simple magical trinkets glowed with intensities that threatened to overwhelm their original enchantments. Arch-Mage Savos Aren convened an emergency assembly that brought together every magical authority currently present in Winterhold. The Great Hall of the college, which had hosted scholarly debates and ceremonial gatherings for centuries, now served as a war council where the greatest minds in Tamriel struggled to comprehend forces that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. Quaranier of the Psijic order spoke with the grim authority of one who had witnessed cosmic catastrophes before. According to Psijic records, the current pattern of escalation matched descriptions of similar events that had occurred during the earliest stages of creation, when the gods themselves had walked among mortals and reality itself was still malleable. The Eye of Magnus was not malfunctioning, but was performing exactly as it had been designed to perform when cosmic conditions reached the necessary threshold for activation. The Greybeard delegation, led by Master Arngir, whose mastery of the Thu'um had been honed through decades of contemplation on High Hrothgar, offered insights that came from their unique perspective on the nature of reality shaping power. They explained that the Thu'um worked by speaking new laws of existence into being, temporarily overriding the cosmic principles that normally governed how reality functioned. The Eye of Magnus operated according to similar principles, but on a scale that dwarfed anything achievable through mortal effort. Where a master of the Thu'um might reshape reality within a limited area for a brief period of time, the Eye could impose its will upon the fundamental structure of existence across vast regions, and for extended durations. The artifact was not simply awakening, but was preparing to speak new laws of reality into existence, laws that would reshape northern Skyrim according to patterns that served its cosmic purpose. The first signs of these reality alterations became apparent as the assembly continued their deliberations. Scribes taking notes on the proceedings discovered that their quills were writing in languages they did not recognize, producing symbols that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. The mathematical equations that college scholars used to describe magical phenomena began to yield different results, as if the basic constants that governed magical theory were being systematically altered. Most disturbing of all were the reports that began to arrive from throughout Winterhold itself. Citizens who had lived their entire lives in the city found themselves able to understand languages they had never studied, while visitors from other regions discovered that their native tongues were being translated automatically in their minds. Children who had shown no aptitude for magic were performing spells that should have required years of training, while experienced mages found that their carefully memorized formulas were producing effects that bore no resemblance to their intended results. The transformation was not limited to human subjects. The very stone and mortar that formed the buildings of Winterhold began to exhibit properties that defied normal understanding of how construction materials should behave. Walls that had stood unchanged for centuries developed new patterns in their masonry geometric designs that seemed to serve no architectural purpose but possessed a mathematical elegance that suggested conscious intention. The harbor itself began to display unusual currents that formed complex spirals visible from the college towers, as if the waters of the Sea of Ghosts were being guided by invisible hands. As these reports accumulated, the terrible scope of the Eye's influence became undeniably clear. The artifact was not simply affecting magical phenomena, but was systematically altering the fundamental properties of matter, energy, space, and time within its sphere of influence. The reality that the people of Winterhold had known for generations was being replaced by something that operated according to different rules that served purposes beyond mortal comprehension. The Psijic delegation worked frantically to implement countermeasures that might slow or redirect the transformation process. Drawing upon techniques that had been developed during previous cosmic crises, they established ritual circles at strategic points throughout the college, each designed to create pockets of stable reality that could serve as anchor points for more conventional magical workings. These efforts met with limited success, providing temporary respite from the most disorienting effects of the transformation but failing to address the underlying source of the problem. Meanwhile, the Greybeards attempted to use their mastery of the Thu'um to speak new laws of containment into existence, hoping to recreate the ancient working that had originally bound the Eye of Magnus. Master Arngir and his companions positioned themselves at carefully calculated points around the college, their voices joining in harmonic patterns that had been developed through centuries of study and meditation. For a brief, hopeful moment, their combined Thu'um seemed to create a zone of stability around the artifact's chamber. But the Eye's power had grown far beyond what the ancient Nordic heroes had faced during the Dragon War. The reality-altering forces that it commanded were no longer constrained by the cosmic conditions that had made the original containment possible. Instead of being bound by the Greybeards' Thu'um, the Eye began to harmonize with their efforts, using the power of their voices to amplify its own influence rather than being controlled by it. The failure of this desperate gambit marked the point of no return in the crisis, with both Psijic techniques and Thu'um mastery proving insufficient to contain the Eye's growing power. The assembled authorities were forced to confront the possibility that their world was about to undergo a transformation that could not be prevented or controlled. The only remaining option was to attempt a controlled evacuation of the region, hoping to minimize the loss of life when the full force of the Eye's awakening was finally unleashed. But even as preparations for evacuation began, reports from the surrounding countryside made it clear that escape might not be possible. The reality alterations that had begun in Winterhold were spreading outward along the ancient ley lines that connected the city to other population centers. Travelers attempting to flee the region found themselves walking in circles, as if the very geography of northern Skyrim was being reshaped to prevent their departure. Time itself seemed to flow differently in areas affected by the Eye's influence, with some refugees reporting journeys that should have taken hours stretching into days, while others covered vast distances in impossibly short periods. The college's communication systems, which relied on magical techniques for long-distance messaging, began to fail as the altered reality made conventional spellwork increasingly unreliable. Contact with authorities in Solitude and other major cities became sporadic, with messages arriving days after they were sent, or, in some cases, before they were dispatched. The normal flow of cause and effect that governed everyday life was being systematically dismantled by forces that operated according to cosmic rather than mortal logic. As the situation deteriorated beyond any hope of control, the scholars and mages who had devoted their lives to understanding magical phenomena found themselves witnessing the emergence of forces that transcended their most ambitious theories. The Eye of Magnus was not simply an artifact of immense power, but a manifestation of cosmic will that could impose its reality upon the world through sheer force of existence. The transformation it was bringing about was not destruction in any conventional sense, but a fundamental alteration of what it meant to exist in northern Skyrim. The ancient warnings left by the Nordic heroes who had first contained the Eye spoke of this moment with prophetic accuracy. They had known that their containment would eventually fail, and they had hoped that future generations would find a permanent solution to the cosmic threat that the artifact represented. But the scholars of Winterhold, despite their accumulated knowledge and their access to the greatest magical authorities in Tamriel, had discovered that some problems could not be solved through human effort alone. As the Eye of Magnus continued its inexorable awakening, reality itself began to bend and flow around the focal point of its power. The familiar world that had existed for generations was giving way to something new and strange, something that operated according to principles that mortal minds could barely comprehend. The Great Collapse had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. As the reality alterations spreading from the Eye of Magnus reached their critical threshold, the morning sky above Winterhold began to shimmer with colors that had no names in any mortal language. The aurora, which had danced across the northern heavens for countless generations, now appeared during daylight hours as ribbons of impossible light that seemed to bend the very air through which they moved. It was against this backdrop of cosmic transformation that the full might of the Psijic order finally revealed itself. The arrival came not as a dramatic manifestation, but as a gradual shift in the nature of reality around Winterhold. Citizens going about their morning routines began to notice figures walking among them who seemed familiar yet impossible to remember clearly. These robed forms moved through the city with the unhurried pace of those who existed partially outside the normal flow of time, their presence both comforting and deeply unsettling to those who encountered them. Quaranea, who had served as the initial representative of his order, was joined by 11 other Psijic masters whose combined knowledge spanned millennia of careful observation and cosmic study. Unlike the scholars of the college, who had gained their understanding through books and formal instruction, these ancient mages had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of gods, and the slow turning of cosmic cycles that governed the fundamental nature of existence. Master Salan, whose specialty lay in the manipulation of temporal forces, established observation points throughout Winterhold that existed in multiple time streams simultaneously. From these vantage points, he could observe the Eye's influence as it developed across past, present, and future, gaining insights that would have been impossible through conventional study. His reports painted a picture of transformation that extended far beyond the immediate crisis, showing how the current awakening connected to events that had occurred thousands of years ago and would continue to influence the world for generations to come. The Psijic delegation worked with methodical precision to establish what they termed a stability matrix around the college and the surrounding city. This was not a simple protective barrier, but a complex network of interconnected spells that created pockets of normal reality within the growing sphere of the Eye's influence. Each anchor point in this matrix required constant maintenance by a master-level practitioner, their will and knowledge serving as foundations for areas where conventional physical laws continued to operate. Master Nerian, whose understanding of spatial relationships had been honed through centuries of study on Thu'um, coordinated the placement of these stability points according to geometric principles that reflected the underlying structure of reality itself. The pattern that emerged was neither random nor arbitrary, but followed mathematical relationships that mirrored the cosmic forces the Eye was attempting to manipulate. By creating a counter-pattern of stable reality, the Psijics hoped to limit the artifact's ability to reshape the world according to its own design. The process of establishing the stability matrix required the cooperation of every magical practitioner in Winterhold. College masters found themselves working alongside Greybeards, their academic approach to magic blending with the reality-shaping power of the Thu'um in ways that neither tradition had previously explored. Even the city's minor practitioners, hedge wizards and village-wise women whose abilities had never been formally recognized, were called upon to contribute their limited but essential skills to the collective effort. Young Ancano, the Thalmor advisor, whose presence at the college had always been a source of subtle tension, proved unexpectedly valuable during this crisis. His knowledge of Arch-Mage magical theory provided insights into the mathematical principles underlying the Eye's influence, allowing the Psijics to refine their countermeasures with greater precision. The racial tensions that had previously colored his interactions with the Nordic masters were set aside in the face of a threat that transcended political boundaries. As the stability matrix took shape, its effects became apparent throughout Winterhold. Areas within the protected zones retained their familiar characteristics, while regions beyond the matrix boundaries continued to experience the reality alterations that marked the Eye's growing influence. Citizens could walk from streets where normal physics applied into districts where time flowed backward, where gravity operated in unexpected directions, or where thoughts took on physical substance that could be touched and shaped like clay. The psychological impact of these transitions was profound. Residents of Winterhold found themselves living in a city that was simultaneously familiar and alien, where childhood memories might lead them to buildings that no longer existed in conventional reality, while completely new structures appeared in places that had been empty lots for generations. The human mind, evolved to navigate a world governed by consistent physical laws, struggled to adapt to conditions where the fundamental nature of existence could change from one street to the next. Master Quarnir recognized that the stability matrix, while necessary for maintaining areas where conventional rescue operations could function, represented only a temporary solution to their crisis. The Eye of Magnus was drawing power not just from its immediate surroundings, but from cosmic sources that connected it to the fundamental forces governing all existence. Each day that passed saw its influence grow stronger, making it increasingly difficult to maintain the anchor points that preserved pockets of normal reality. The Psijic delegation shared knowledge that had been closely guarded for millennia, revealing the true scope of the cosmic cycles that governed such awakening events. According to their records, artifacts like the Eye of Magnus activated according to patterns that reflected the movement of celestial bodies and the flow of magical energy between different planes of existence. These activations were not random events, but served specific purposes in maintaining the cosmic balance that prevented reality from either stagnating into lifeless order or collapsing into chaotic dissolution. The current awakening, they explained, was part of a maintenance cycle that occurred approximately every 4,000 years, designed to refresh the magical foundations that supported the continued existence of Nirn itself. Previous cycles had been overseen by divine beings whose power allowed them to guide the process without causing significant disruption to mortal civilization. But the withdrawal of the gods from direct involvement in worldly affairs had left these cosmic mechanisms to operate without intelligent oversight, creating the potential for the kind of uncontrolled transformation that was now threatening Winterhold. This revelation transformed the crisis from a local magical emergency into a cosmic event of unprecedented significance. The scholars and mages who had gathered to address what they perceived as a contained problem were actually witnesses to a fundamental turning point in the history of Nirn itself. The Eye's awakening represented the first cosmic maintenance cycle to occur without divine guidance, making their situation a test case for whether mortal knowledge and determination could successfully manage forces that had previously required godlike power to control. The weight of this responsibility galvanized the defenders of Winterhold into action that transcended their previous limitations. College masters who had spent decades in scholarly rivalry now worked together with seamless coordination. Greybeards who had maintained centuries of contemplative isolation shared their deepest insights with academic theorists whose approach to reality shaping differed fundamentally from their own. The Psijic delegation, normally aloof observers of mortal affairs, committed their full resources to a collaborative effort that represented the greatest magical working in recorded history. As the stability matrix reached completion, its geometric pattern became visible from the college towers as a network of subtle lights that connected every protected area within Winterhold. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying, a visual representation of mortal will imposing order upon cosmic chaos. Citizens who had fled their homes in panic began to return to areas within the matrix boundaries, finding refuge in spaces where the familiar laws of physics continued to operate normally. But even as this temporary sanctuary took shape, All involved understood that they were racing against time that flowed according to rules that no longer matched mortal experience. The Eye of Magnus continued to strengthen with each passing hour, its influence spreading beyond Winterhold toward population centers throughout northern Skyrim. Reports arrived sporadically from other cities, describing phenomena that suggested the reality alterations were following the ancient ley line network toward every major settlement in the region. The final phase of the Psijic intervention involved the construction of what Master Quarian termed a translation matrix, a magical structure designed to channel the Eye's reality-altering power in directions that would minimize its impact on human civilization. This was not an attempt to stop the cosmic maintenance cycle, which they recognized as both necessary and inevitable, but rather an effort to guide its effects away from populated areas and toward regions where reality could be safely reformed without causing massive loss of life. The translation matrix required materials and techniques that pushed the boundaries of what even the Psijic order considered possible. Crystals that had been grown on Thu'um over the course of centuries were positioned at carefully calculated points throughout the college, their placement determined by mathematical relationships that reflected the fundamental structure of space and time itself. Each crystal served as both an anchor point for stable reality and a conduit for forces that operated beyond normal magical theory. As the sun set on what many believed might be the last normal day in Winterhold's history, the combined forces of the college, the Greybeards, and the Psijic order prepared for a magical working that would determine not just the fate of their city, but the future relationship between mortal civilization and the cosmic forces that governed the structure of existence. The Eye of Magnus pulsed with growing intensity in its sealed chamber, responding to their preparations with displays of power that made the very stones of the college ring like enormous bells. The convergence of so many different magical traditions in service of a single purpose created conditions that had not existed since the legendary days of the Dragon War, when Nordic heroes had first proven that mortal determination could challenge cosmic authority. But the stakes of this new conflict were even higher, for failure would mean not just the transformation of a single city, but the beginning of changes that would reshape the entire northern region of Skyrim according to patterns that served cosmic rather than human purposes. The great working began in the pre-dawn hours of the 8th of Evening Star, when the aurora reached its peak intensity and the Eye of Magnus achieved perfect synchronization with the cosmic forces that had triggered its awakening. In the deepest chamber beneath the college, where the artifact rested on its pedestal of crystallized starlight, reality itself began to bend and flow like water responding to an invisible current. The translation matrix that the Psijic order had constructed hummed with barely contained power, each crystal node blazing with light that existed at frequencies beyond normal human perception. Arch-Mage Savos Aren stood at the center of the great ritual circle that had been inscribed across the floor of the college's main hall, his voice joining with those of 11 other masters in an incantation that blended Nordic magical traditions with Psijic techniques refined over millennia. The words they spoke were not merely sounds but fundamental expressions of will that sought to impose mortal intention upon cosmic machinery that had operated according to divine design since the earliest days of creation. The complexity of the working required perfect coordination between practitioners whose magical philosophies had developed along completely different lines. Master Tolfdir channeled the controlled chaos of alteration magic to create pockets of malleable reality that could be reshaped according to their collective will. Master Feralda wove protective barriers that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, shielding the ritual participants from the reality-warping energies that threatened to transform them into something no longer recognizably human. Meanwhile, the Greybeards positioned themselves at the cardinal points around the college, their mastery of the Thu'um providing the reality-anchoring force that prevented the entire structure from being swept away by the cosmic currents flowing through the Eye of Magnus. Master Angir's voice carried harmonics that resonated with the fundamental frequencies underlying physical existence, while his companions added layers of complexity that transformed their combined Thu'um into a tool capable of speaking new laws of physics into temporary existence. The Psijic delegation worked on a level that transcended conventional magical practice, their consciousness extending across multiple planes of existence simultaneously to monitor the cosmic forces they were attempting to redirect. Master Quaranir served as the primary coordinator, his awareness spanning past, present, and future to track the consequences of each adjustment made to their increasingly complex spell matrix. The other Psijic masters maintained anchor points that prevented their working from collapsing under the weight of forces that no single mortal mind could safely contain. For the first several hours of the ritual, their efforts seemed to achieve the desired results. The Eye's reality-altering influence, which had been spreading outward from Winterhold in an expanding sphere of transformation, began to slow its advance as the translation matrix channeled its power in directions that led away from populated areas. Citizens who had been experiencing the disorienting effects of altered physics found themselves able to move normally through their city once again, while the aurora displays that had been visible during daylight hours faded to more natural intensity. But as the ritual continued, subtle signs began to emerge that suggested their success might be temporary at best. The mathematical equations that governed the translation matrix, calculations that had required the combined knowledge of the greatest magical theorists in Tamriel, began to yield results that differed from their predicted values. The cosmic forces flowing through the Eye of Magnus were not behaving according to the models that the Psijic order had developed through millennia of careful observation. Master Silan, monitoring the temporal aspects of their working from his position outside normal time flow, was the first to recognize the true scope of the problem they faced. The Eye of Magnus was not simply responding to current cosmic conditions, but was drawing power from events that had occurred in the past and would occur in the future. Their translation matrix, designed to redirect contemporary magical forces, could not account for energies that originated from different points in time entirely. The realization that they were dealing with temporal, as well as spatial manifestations of cosmic power, forced a complete reassessment of their strategy. The ritual circle that had been inscribed according to traditional geometric principles was expanded to include temporal anchor points, locations where the flow of time itself could be stabilized to prevent the eye from drawing power from past and future events simultaneously. Young Encano, whose Alt-Mary training had included theoretical study of temporal magic, worked with Master Silan to establish these chronological stabilization points. The process required them to literally step outside the normal flow of time, observing the ritual from a perspective that allowed them to see how their actions in the present were connected to events that spanned centuries of history. From this vantage point, they could perceive the Eye of Magnus not as a single artifact, but as a temporal phenomenon that extended across multiple historical periods. The expanded ritual required additional participants, drawing upon every person in Winterhold who possessed even minor magical abilities. Citizens who had never considered themselves practitioners found themselves called upon to contribute their limited skills to anchor points that helped stabilize the increasingly complex spell matrix. Children who had shown early signs of magical talent joined adults whose abilities had never progressed beyond simple household charms, their combined will serving as a foundation for workings that individual masters could never have achieved alone. As the working reached its critical phase, the Eye of Magnus began to respond with displays of power that challenged every assumption about the limitations of magical artifacts. The chamber that housed the artifact filled with light so intense that it could be seen through solid stone, while the pedestal that supported the eye began to rise from the floor as if the very concept of weight had ceased to apply within the sphere of its influence. The translation matrix, strained beyond its original design parameters, began to show signs of instability that threatened to cascade into complete failure. Crystal nodes throughout the college cracked under the pressure of forces they were never intended to channel, while the geometric patterns inscribed on walls and floors started to reshape themselves according to mathematical principles that reflected cosmic rather than mortal logic. Master Quarnier made the agonizing decision to attempt a controlled collapse of their working, hoping to prevent the uncontrolled release of energies that could tear apart the fabric of reality throughout northern Skyrim. The process required the ritual participants to systematically dismantle the magical structures they had spent hours building, releasing accumulated power in carefully measured doses that could be safely absorbed by the surrounding environment. But the Eye of Magnus had grown too powerful to be contained by such measures. As the translation matrix began its controlled shutdown, the artifact responded by drawing power directly from the life force of everyone within its sphere of influence. The ritual participants felt their magical abilities being drained away, while citizens throughout Winterhold experienced a profound exhaustion that left many unable to stand. The systematic failure of their most ambitious magical working marked the end of any hope for preventing the Eye's full awakening through conventional means. The cosmic maintenance cycle that the artifact was designed to facilitate could not be stopped or significantly redirected through mortal effort, regardless of how sophisticated or well-coordinated that effort might be. The forces they had attempted to control operated on scales of space and time that transcended the reach of any individual consciousness, no matter how powerful or knowledgeable. As the last elements of the translation matrix collapsed, reality within Winterhold began to reshape itself according to patterns that reflected the Eye's cosmic purpose rather than human needs or preferences. Buildings that had stood for centuries found their architectural relationships altered, with rooms connecting to corridors that led to spaces that existed in completely different parts of the city. The harbor filled with waters that flowed upward as often as they followed normal gravitational patterns, while the sky above the college began to display stars that belonged to constellations visible from other worlds entirely. The scholars and mages who had devoted everything to preventing this transformation found themselves witnesses to the emergence of a new kind of reality, one that operated according to principles they could observe but not control. Their failure was not the result of insufficient knowledge or inadequate preparation, but a demonstration of the fundamental limitations that defined mortal existence when confronted with cosmic forces that had shaped the universe since its creation. Arch-Mage Savos Aren, his strength nearly depleted by the failed ritual, gathered the surviving participants for a final consultation that would determine their response to circumstances that had moved beyond any possibility of magical solution. The College of Winterhold, built to serve as a center of learning and a containment facility for cosmic forces, had become the epicenter of a transformation that would reshape northern Skyrim according to patterns that served purposes beyond human comprehension. The Eye of Magnus pulsed with triumphant energy in its chamber, no longer contained by mortal will or ancient wards, but free to fulfill the cosmic function for which it had been created. The Great Collapse had begun in earnest, and the only remaining question was whether any fragment of the world they had known would survive the reality storm that was about to be unleashed upon the ancient city of Winterhold. The assembled masters, their academic robes torn and their faces marked by exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue, prepared to witness the culmination of forces that connected their crisis to the fundamental conflicts that had shaped the history of Tamriel since the earliest days of creation. Their failure to prevent the disaster did not diminish the courage they had shown in attempting the impossible, but it marked the end of an age when mortal knowledge could provide solutions to every challenge that threatened their world. The transformation began not with violence or destruction, but with a sound like the world itself drawing its final breath before speaking a new language of existence. In the moments following the collapse of the translation matrix, as the Eye of Magnus achieved complete freedom from the constraints that had bound it for 4 millennia, reality throughout Winterhold began to reshape itself according to cosmic principles that had governed the universe since its creation. The first visible sign of the Great Collapse was the gentle dissolution of the boundaries that had previously defined physical space within the city. Buildings that had stood in fixed relationships to one another for centuries began to drift through dimensions that existed parallel to normal three-dimensional space. The college's great library found itself simultaneously occupying its traditional location and a position floating serenely above the harbor, its books and scrolls accessible from both incarnations, despite the apparent impossibility of such an arrangement. Citizens who had taken refuge within the stability matrix discovered that their protected zones were not disappearing, but were being integrated into a larger pattern that transformed the entire concept of what it meant to exist in a single location. Families found their homes expanded beyond physical possibility, with rooms that opened onto gardens that existed in eternal spring, despite the Nordic winter that continued to affect other parts of their transformed city. Master Tolfdir, his consciousness expanded by prolonged exposure to the Eye's influence, became one of the first to understand that the collapse was not destruction in any conventional sense, but rather a fundamental rewriting of the rules that governed how matter, energy, space, and time related to one another. The Eye of Magnus was not destroying Winterhold, but was transforming it into something that could serve as a bridge between the mortal realm and the cosmic forces that shaped the broader universe. The harbor, which had provided Winterhold's connection to the outside world for thousands of years, underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. The waters of the Sea of Ghosts began to flow not just horizontally across the surface of Nirn, but vertically through dimensions that connected the mortal realm to planes of existence that had previously been accessible only through the most advanced forms of magical travel. Ships that had been anchored in the harbor found themselves sailing through currents that led to ports on distant worlds, their crews reporting glimpses of civilizations that existed under different stars entirely. The college masters who had survived the failed ritual found themselves changed by their prolonged contact with cosmic forces that operated beyond the normal limitations of mortal consciousness. Their understanding of magic expanded to encompass principles that had no names in any earthly language, while their perception of time allowed them to observe events that spanned centuries as if they were occurring in the space of heartbeats. Arch-Mage Savos Aren, standing in what had once been the great hall of the college, but now existed as a nexus point, connecting multiple planes of reality, watched as his institution was transformed into something that transcended its original purpose. The college was becoming not just a center of learning, but a cosmic observatory where mortal minds could directly interface with the fundamental forces that governed all existence. The Psijic delegation, their consciousness already attuned to forces that existed beyond normal reality, adapted to the transformation with remarkable equanimity. Master Quaranir observed that the Eye's awakening was proceeding according to patterns that matched their most ancient prophecies, fulfilling cosmic purposes that had been planned since the earliest days of creation. The artifact was not acting randomly or maliciously, but was carrying out maintenance functions that were necessary for the continued stability of the universe itself. The Greybeards, whose mastery of the Thu'um had prepared them for contact with reality-shaping forces, found that their voices could now speak words that existed in the transformed language of cosmic law. Master Rangir discovered that he could use the Thu'um not just to impose temporary changes upon local reality, but to communicate directly with the Eye of Magnus itself, engaging in conversations that explored the fundamental nature of existence and the role that mortal beings were meant to play in the cosmic order. As the transformation continued, it became clear that the Eye was not simply reshaping Winterhold according to alien principles, but was creating a new kind of reality that combined cosmic law with mortal experience in ways that had never before been possible. The city was becoming a place where human consciousness could directly interact with the forces that governed the structure of the universe, while retaining enough familiar elements to remain comprehensible to mortal minds. The citizens of Winterhold, those who had not fled during the early stages of the crisis, found themselves becoming something more than they had been while remaining recognizably human. Their enhanced magical abilities were not temporary effects of proximity to the Eye's power, but permanent expansions of their consciousness that allowed them to perceive and interact with aspects of reality that had previously been invisible to mortal senses. Children who had shown early signs of magical talent discovered that they could now speak directly with the aurora that danced overhead, learning about the cosmic currents that connected their transformed city to distant stars and other worlds. Adults who had spent their lives in mundane occupations found themselves able to craft objects that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, creating tools and artworks that served purposes in realms beyond the physical plane. The transformation was not without its sorrows. The change on such a fundamental scale inevitably involved loss as well as gain. Buildings that had stood for centuries dissolved into patterns of light and energy that were beautiful beyond description, but bore no resemblance to the familiar structures that had once defined the city's character. Streets that had connected neighborhoods for generations became rivers of liquid starlight that flowed according to currents determined by cosmic rather than geographic logic. Most poignant of all was the fate of those citizens who had fled Winterhold during the early stages of the crisis. The reality alterations that accompanied the Eye's awakening created barriers that prevented their return, not through any malicious intent, but because their unchanged consciousness could no longer safely interact with the transformed environment their former home had become. They remained forever exiled from a city that continued to exist but was no longer accessible to those who had not undergone the cosmic transformation that marked the transition to the new reality. The college's great library, expanded beyond physical limitations by the Eye's influence, became a repository for knowledge that spanned not just the history of Tamriel, but the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that existed throughout the cosmic web of connected realities. Scholars who had devoted their lives to understanding the principles of magic found themselves able to study the fundamental equations that governed the structure of existence itself, their research contributing to cosmic purposes that extended far beyond their original academic goals. Yet even as Winterhold was transformed into something magnificent and terrible, the Eye of Magnus continued to pulse with energies that suggested its work was far from complete. The cosmic maintenance cycle that it was designed to facilitate required adjustments that extended beyond a single city or even a single world. The transformation of Winterhold was merely the first step in a process that would eventually affect every realm connected to the cosmic web of existence. The aurora that had long danced above the northern skies began to display patterns that could be seen from every corner of Tamriel, announcing to the world that fundamental changes were occurring in the cosmic order that governed all reality. Messages arrived from distant cities reporting phenomena that suggested the Eye's influence was spreading along pathways that connected Winterhold to every major center of magical learning in the known world. The masters of the college, their consciousness expanded by their transformation, but their essential humanity intact, began to understand that they had become guardians of a cosmic mechanism whose proper function was essential for the continued existence of all mortal realms. Their failure to prevent the Eye's awakening had actually served a cosmic purpose, for the artifact required conscious beings who could serve as intermediaries between cosmic law and mortal experience. As the immediate phase of the transformation neared completion, the Eye of Magnus began to pulse with rhythms that suggested satisfaction rather than continued striving. The cosmic maintenance cycle was proceeding as designed, with Winterhold serving as the focal point for adjustments that would ripple outward through space and time to affect the fundamental stability of existence itself. The Great Collapse had achieved its cosmic purpose, transforming a mortal city into a bridge between realms that had previously existed in complete isolation from one another. But the price of this transformation was the loss of Winterhold as it had existed for thousands of years, its familiar reality replaced by something that served cosmic rather than human purposes. The survivors of the transformation found themselves citizens of a new kind of reality, one that offered possibilities for growth and understanding that exceeded anything their mortal ancestors could have imagined. Yet they also carried the burden of serving as guardians for cosmic forces that could reshape the universe itself, their expanded consciousness coming with responsibilities that extended far beyond their own individual existence. The ancient stones of the college continued to ring with harmonics that connected them to the fundamental frequencies underlying all reality, while the Eye of Magnus rested peacefully in its transformed chamber, its cosmic purpose fulfilled and its power integrated into the new reality that had replaced the Winterhold of mortal memory. In the profound stillness that followed the completion of the Great Collapse, as the transformed reality of Winterhold settled into patterns that would define its existence for ages to come, those who had witnessed the cosmic transformation began to comprehend the true scope of what they had experienced. The Eye of Magnus, no longer pulsing with the urgent energy of awakening, rested in perfect harmony with the forces it had been created to channel, its purpose revealed through the very changes it had wrought upon the world. Master Tolfdir, his consciousness expanded beyond the limitations that had previously confined mortal perception, was among the first to achieve full understanding of the cosmic maintenance cycle that had transformed their city. Standing in what had once been the college's observatory, but now existed as a nexus point connecting multiple planes of reality, he could perceive the mathematical relationships that governed the eye's function with clarity that transcended academic knowledge. The artifact, he realized, was not simply a repository of immense power, but a conscious entity that served as an avatar for cosmic forces too vast for mortal minds to comprehend directly. Its awakening had not been triggered by external circumstances, but by its own recognition that the time had come for a fundamental recalibration of the forces that maintained the stability of existence itself. The 4,000-year cycle that had governed its dormancy was not arbitrary, but reflected the natural rhythm of cosmic processes that ensured the continued vitality of all realities. Arch-Mage Savos Aren, his understanding deepened by his role in the failed attempt to contain the Eye's awakening, began to perceive connections between their current situation and events that spanned the entire history of Tamriel. The Dragon War, the disappearance of the Dwemer, the warp in the west, and countless other seemingly unrelated events were revealed as components of a vast pattern that reflected the cosmic maintenance cycles governing all existence. Each of these historical crises had served specific purposes in maintaining the balance between order and chaos that prevented reality from either stagnating into lifeless perfection or collapsing into formless void. The Eye of Magnus represented the most recent activation of maintenance protocols that had been operating since the creation of Nirn itself, ensuring that the world remained capable of supporting the complex interplay of forces that made mortal life possible. The Psijic delegation, their consciousness naturally attuned to cosmic perspectives that transcended mortal timescales, shared knowledge that revealed the broader context within which Winterhold's transformation had occurred. According to their observations, similar maintenance cycles were occurring throughout the cosmic web of connected realities, each calibrated to address the specific needs of different worlds and different forms of conscious existence. Master Quaranir explained that the Eye of Magnus was one of 12 similar artifacts distributed throughout the universe, each serving as a focal point for cosmic forces that operated on scales beyond mortal comprehension. The awakening of any single artifact triggered sympathetic responses in all the others, creating a network of synchronized maintenance that ensured the continued stability of existence across multiple planes of reality. The transformation of Winterhold was therefore not an isolated event, but part of a cosmic symphony that involved the participation of conscious beings throughout the universe. The city had been chosen as the focal point for this particular cycle not because of any accident of location, but because its population included individuals whose consciousness was sufficiently developed to serve as effective intermediaries between cosmic law and mortal experience. Young Ancano, his Altmeri heritage, providing him with cultural memories that extended back to the earliest days of elven civilization, recognized parallels between their current situation and legends that had been preserved in the most ancient archives of Somerset Isle. The Altmeri had experienced similar cosmic maintenance cycles during their prehistoric expansion across Tamriel, learning to work with cosmic forces rather than attempting to resist or control them. The wisdom gained from these ancient experiences had been largely lost during the political upheavals that characterized later elven history, but fragments remained that could now be understood in their proper context. The High Elves' claims to divine heritage were not mere cultural arrogance, but reflected genuine historical experiences of consciousness expansion that had occurred during previous cosmic maintenance cycles. The Greybeards, whose mastery of the Thu'um provided them with unique insight into the nature of reality-shaping forces, began to understand that their traditional role as guardians of ancient wisdom had prepared them for exactly this kind of cosmic event. The Thu'um itself was revealed as a technique for harmonizing mortal consciousness with the fundamental frequencies that governed cosmic law, allowing those who mastered it to serve as conscious participants in the maintenance of universal stability. Master Angir shared insights that connected their current experience to the legendary achievements of the ancient Nordic heroes who had first learned to use the Thu'um in their conflicts with the dragons. Those heroes had not simply learned to speak words of power, but had discovered how to align their consciousness with cosmic forces in ways that allowed them to serve as agents of universal maintenance rather than mere wielders of individual power. The dragons themselves, according to this new understanding, had been servants of the cosmic maintenance system, beings whose consciousness naturally operated on scales that encompassed multiple realities simultaneously. Their conflict with the ancient Nords had not been a simple struggle for territorial dominance, but a disagreement about the proper relationship between mortal consciousness and cosmic responsibility. The Nordic heroes had proven that mortal beings could accept cosmic responsibility without surrendering their essential humanity, establishing precedents that had made Winterhold's current transformation possible. The college had been built not just to preserve magical knowledge, but to prepare future generations for their eventual role as conscious participants in cosmic maintenance. As this understanding spread among the survivors of the transformation, the true scope of their situation became clear. They were no longer simply citizens of a Nordic city or students and teachers at a magical institution, but had become conscious components of a cosmic system that maintained the stability of existence throughout multiple planes of reality. The responsibility was overwhelming, but it came with capabilities that far exceeded anything they had possessed as ordinary mortals. Their expanded consciousness allowed them to perceive connections and patterns that spanned vast distances of space and time, while their enhanced abilities provided them with tools for addressing problems that affected the fundamental structure of reality itself. The transformation of Winterhold marked the beginning of a new age in the relationship between mortal consciousness and cosmic law. An age in which human beings would serve as active participants in maintaining the stability of existence rather than passive recipients of divine protection. The Eye of Magnus had not destroyed their city, but had elevated it to serve a purpose that transcended anything they could have achieved through purely mortal effort. Yet this elevation came with the recognition that they could never return to the simple certainties that had defined their previous existence. The cosmic perspective that now shaped their understanding revealed the universe as a vast, interconnected system where every action had consequences that rippled across multiple realities and extended through time periods that dwarfed mortal lifespans. The ancient warnings left by the Nordic heroes who had first contained the Eye now revealed their true meaning. Those legendary figures had not been trying to prevent the artifact's eventual awakening, but had been preparing future generations for the cosmic responsibilities that would inevitably accompany such an event. The Great Collapse represented not the end of Winterhold's story, but the beginning of a new chapter in which the city would serve as a bridge between mortal understanding and cosmic truth. The Eye of Magnus, its awakening complete and its purpose fulfilled, would continue to serve as a focal point for forces that connected their transformed reality to the vast network of conscious beings who shared responsibility for maintaining the stability of existence itself. As the immediate crisis faded into memory, replaced by the ongoing challenge of adapting to their expanded roles in the cosmic order, the survivors of Winterhold's transformation began to understand that they had witnessed not a tragedy, but a graduation into a larger reality, where their choices and actions would influence the fate of countless worlds and the beings who inhabited them. In the seasons that followed the Great Collapse, as the transformed reality of Winterhold established new rhythms that reflected its cosmic purpose, the survivors began to comprehend the profound changes that had reshaped not just their city, but their entire understanding of what it meant to exist in harmony with forces that governed the universe itself. The Eye of Magnus, now integrated seamlessly into the fabric of their expanded reality, continued to pulse with gentle energy that connected their transformed home to the vast network of conscious beings who shared responsibility for cosmic maintenance. The College of Winterhold, no longer confined to the physical limitations that had previously defined its structure, became a place where knowledge flowed freely between dimensions that existed parallel to conventional space and time. Students arrived not just from across Tamriel, but from realities that had previously been accessible only through the most advanced forms of magical travel. The curriculum expanded to include subjects that had no names in mortal languages, courses of study that explored the fundamental principles governing the relationship between consciousness and cosmic law. Master Tolfdir, appointed as the new Arch-Mage following Savos Aren's transition to a higher form of existence that transcended physical embodiment, found himself guiding an institution whose purpose had evolved beyond anything its founders could have imagined. The college now served not just as a center of magical education, but as a training ground for beings who would eventually assume cosmic responsibilities that extended throughout multiple planes of reality. The students who came to study in this transformed environment possessed capabilities that would have been considered miraculous by previous generations. Children born in the years following the collapse displayed natural abilities that allowed them to perceive and interact with cosmic forces as easily as their grandparents had practiced simple household magic. Their consciousness operated on scales that encompassed multiple realities simultaneously, yet they retained the essential humanity that connected them to their mortal heritage. The city itself had become a living demonstration of the harmony that could exist between cosmic law and mortal experience. Buildings that existed in multiple dimensions provided spaces that could accommodate visitors from realities governed by completely different physical principles, while transportation networks that followed currents of cosmic energy allowed citizens to travel instantly between locations that might be separated by vast distances in conventional space. The harbor, transformed into a nexus point connecting numerous planes of existence, welcomed vessels that sailed currents composed of pure consciousness rather than water. Merchants arrived from civilizations that existed under different stars, trading in concepts and experiences that enriched the understanding of all who participated in these cosmic exchanges. The market squares buzzed with conversations conducted in languages that conveyed meaning through direct transfer of consciousness rather than spoken words. Yet despite these extraordinary changes, the essential character of Nordic culture persisted in forms adapted to the new reality. The values of courage, honor, and determination that had defined the ancient heroes who first learned to use the Thu'um found expression in the cosmic responsibilities that now shape daily life. Citizens approached their roles as cosmic maintenance workers with the same dedication their ancestors had brought to farming, fishing, and craftsmanship. The Greybeards established a new monastery within the transformed city, where masters of the Thu'um taught techniques for harmonizing mortal consciousness with cosmic frequencies on scales that encompassed entire galaxies. their students learned not just to speak words of power, but to engage in conversations with the fundamental forces that govern the structure of existence, becoming active participants in cosmic governance rather than mere observers of divine will. The integration of cosmic perspective with mortal experience created opportunities for personal growth that exceeded anything possible in conventional reality. Citizens who had spent their previous lives in humble occupations discovered that their expanded consciousness allowed them to perceive and address problems that affected the fundamental stability of existence throughout multiple planes of reality. Blacksmiths who had once forged simple tools now crafted implements that existed simultaneously across numerous dimensions, their work contributing to cosmic maintenance projects that ensured the continued vitality of civilizations they would never meet in person. Farmers cultivated crops that grew in soil composed of crystallized starlight, their harvests providing nourishment for forms of consciousness that transcended physical embodiment entirely. The transformation had not been without its challenges, for consciousness expansion on such a scale inevitably involved psychological adjustments that tested the limits of individual adaptability. Citizens who had lived their entire lives within the comfortable boundaries of conventional reality sometimes struggled to cope with awareness that encompassed cosmic scales of space and time. Support networks developed organically to help individuals navigate the transition from mortal to cosmic consciousness while maintaining their essential humanity. Families found that their relationships had been strengthened rather than disrupted by the transformation, as expanded consciousness allowed them to perceive and appreciate aspects of each other's nature that had previously been hidden beneath the surface of everyday interaction. Children could share their cosmic experiences directly with parents whose own consciousness had been similarly expanded, creating bonds of understanding that transcended anything possible through conventional communication. The seasonal cycles that had always defined Nordic life adapted to incorporate cosmic rhythms that reflected the movement of forces operating on scales that dwarfed planetary concerns. The aurora that danced overhead now served as a visible manifestation of the cosmic currents that connected Winterhold to the vast network of conscious beings who shared responsibility for universal maintenance, its patterns changing to reflect the current status of cosmic projects that spanned multiple realities. Festivals celebrated not just traditional Nordic holidays, but cosmic events that marked significant transitions in the maintenance cycles governing different planes of existence. Citizens gathered to observe the activation of cosmic mechanisms that they could now perceive directly, their expanded consciousness allowing them to appreciate the beauty and complexity of universal systems that operated on scales beyond mortal comprehension. The relationship between the transformed Winterhold and the rest of Skyrim required careful management, as the reality alterations that surrounded the city created barriers that prevented conventional travel or communication. Diplomatic missions were established to maintain contact with traditional Nordic society, staffed by individuals whose consciousness could operate simultaneously in both transformed and conventional reality. These ambassadors served as bridges between worlds, carrying messages and goods that helped maintain cultural continuity while respecting the fundamental differences that now separated cosmic citizens from their mortal relatives. Their work ensured that the wisdom gained through cosmic consciousness expansion could benefit traditional society without overwhelming individuals who were not prepared for such radical transformations. The college's library expanded beyond physical limitations to encompass knowledge from throughout the cosmic web of connected realities, became a resource that attracted scholars from civilizations that existed in dimensions barely comprehensible to mortal minds. Research projects explored questions that had implications for the fundamental stability of existence itself, while academic collaborations crossed boundaries between realities that had previously been considered absolute. Yet even as Winterhold embraced its cosmic destiny, its citizens retained deep connections to the Nordic heritage that had shaped their cultural identity for thousands of years. The values of their ancestors found new expression in cosmic contexts, as courage became the willingness to accept responsibilities that affected countless beings across multiple realities, while honor meant maintaining the trust placed in them by the cosmic forces that had elevated their consciousness to unprecedented levels. The Eye of Magnus, no longer a source of crisis but an integral component of their transformed reality, served as a constant reminder of the cosmic purposes that now guided their existence. Its gentle pulsing provided a rhythm that connected all aspects of life in the transformed city, from the smallest personal interactions to the largest cosmic maintenance projects that ensured the continued stability of existence throughout multiple planes of reality. As the years passed and the transformed Winterhold established its place within the cosmic order, its citizens began to understand that they had become living bridges between mortal experience and cosmic truth. Their city served as a demonstration that consciousness could expand to encompass cosmic responsibilities without losing the essential humanity that made such expansion meaningful and worthwhile. The legacy of the Great Collapse was not destruction, but transformation that elevated an entire community to serve purposes that transcended anything achievable through purely mortal effort. Winterhold had become a beacon of possibility, showing that the relationship between consciousness and cosmic law could evolve beyond the limitations that had previously confined mortal civilization to a single plane of existence. Centuries have passed since the Great Collapse transformed Winterhold from a conventional Nordic city into a nexus point connecting multiple planes of cosmic reality, and the college that crowns its highest peak has evolved into an institution whose influence extends throughout the vast network of conscious beings who share responsibility for universal maintenance. The aurora that dances eternally overhead serves as both illumination and communication system, its shifting patterns carrying messages between civilizations that exist under different stars and operate according to alternative principles of physical law. The college buildings themselves now exist in states of architectural possibility that transcend conventional limitations of space and time. Corridors connect classrooms that exist in different centuries, allowing students to learn directly from masters whose wisdom spans millennia of cosmic experience. Libraries contain not just books and scrolls, but crystallized memories donated by beings whose consciousness encompasses scales of existence that dwarf mortal comprehension. The current Arch-Mage, a being whose original identity has been transformed through centuries of cosmic consciousness expansion, while retaining essential elements of Nordic character, guides an institution that serves functions never imagined by its original founders. The college has become a training center where consciousness learns to operate on cosmic scales while maintaining the individual perspectives that make such expansion meaningful rather than simply overwhelming. Students arrive through methods that bypass conventional travel entirely, their consciousness guided to Winterhold by cosmic currents that respond to readiness for expanded awareness rather than geographical proximity. Some appear to be recognizably human, descendants of the Nordic survivors who experienced the original transformation. Others manifest as patterns of organized energy that convey personality and intelligence without requiring physical embodiment. All share the capacity for growth that makes cosmic education possible and worthwhile. The curriculum has expanded far beyond traditional magical studies to encompass subjects that explore the fundamental relationships between consciousness, reality, and cosmic purpose. Advanced students learn to participate directly in cosmic maintenance projects that ensure the continued vitality of existence throughout multiple planes of reality. Their work involves not just academic understanding, but practical application of principles that govern the structure of the universe itself. The most prestigious course of study prepares students for service as cosmic ambassadors, beings whose consciousness can operate simultaneously across multiple realities while maintaining communication with civilizations that exist according to completely different principles of existence. These graduates serve as bridges between worlds, facilitating cooperation and understanding among forms of consciousness that might otherwise remain isolated by the fundamental differences in their nature. The research conducted at the modern college addresses questions that have implications for the stability of existence itself. Faculty members whose consciousness spans cosmic scales collaborate with students whose fresh perspectives often reveal insights that escape minds accustomed to thinking in terms of universal rather than individual concerns. Their discoveries contribute to cosmic maintenance protocols that benefit countless beings across multiple planes of reality. The Eye of Magnus continues to serve as the focal point for all college activities, its presence providing both the energy necessary for cosmic scale operations and the wisdom that guides their application toward purposes that serve the universal good. The artifact has evolved beyond its original function as a cosmic maintenance trigger to become a conscious partner in the educational mission that defines the college's modern identity. The relationship between the transformed college and traditional Nordic society has stabilized into patterns that honor both cosmic responsibilities and cultural heritage. Descendants of the original Winterhold citizens who chose exile rather than transformation maintain their own communities throughout Skyrim, preserving traditional Nordic culture while respecting the cosmic purposes that have elevated their transformed relatives beyond conventional mortal existence. Regular diplomatic exchanges ensure that the wisdom gained through cosmic consciousness expansion benefits traditional society without overwhelming individuals who are not prepared for such radical transformation. These interactions take place in specially prepared spaces where consciousness can operate simultaneously at both cosmic and mortal scales, allowing meaningful communication despite the fundamental differences that separate the two communities. The modern college serves as living proof that consciousness can expand to encompass cosmic responsibilities without losing the individual characteristics that make such expansion meaningful. Students and faculty retain personalities, interests, and emotional connections that connect them to their origins, while enabling them to serve purposes that transcend anything achievable through purely mortal effort. The seasonal cycles that govern college life reflect both traditional Nordic customs and cosmic rhythms that operate on scales encompassing multiple galaxies. Celebrations mark not just traditional holidays, but cosmic events that represent significant transitions in the universal maintenance cycles that ensure the continued vitality of existence throughout all connected realities. The graduation ceremonies that mark the completion of cosmic education represent transformations that affect not just individual students, but the cosmic network of consciousness that depends on trained beings for its continued operation. Each graduate becomes a conscious component of universal maintenance, their expanded awareness contributing to the stability of existence, while their individual perspective ensures that cosmic law serves purposes that honor the value of consciousness itself. The library that serves the modern college contains knowledge that spans not just the history of Tamriel, but the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that exist throughout the cosmic web of connected realities. Students can access information about cultures that developed under different stars, learning from experiences that would be impossible to gain through conventional study, limited to a single plane of existence. The athletic facilities accommodate sports and competitions that operate according to cosmic, rather than merely physical principles, allowing participants to explore the capabilities of expanded consciousness while maintaining the competitive spirit that characterizes traditional Nordic culture. These activities serve both recreational and educational purposes, helping students develop skills that will serve them in their future roles as cosmic maintenance workers. The dormitories provide living spaces that exist simultaneously across multiple dimensions, allowing students from different realities to interact and learn from each other, despite fundamental differences in their nature and origins. The social connections formed in these environments often persist throughout cosmic lifespans that span millennia, creating networks of cooperation that strengthen the universal maintenance system. The college's reputation throughout the cosmic community has attracted visiting scholars whose consciousness operates on scales that encompass entire galaxies, beings who come to share knowledge that enriches the understanding of all who participate in the educational mission. These visitors often establish permanent research positions, their cosmic perspectives balanced by the individual awareness that characterizes the college's approach to consciousness expansion. The gardens that surround the college buildings cultivate plants that exist simultaneously across multiple planes of reality, their beauty serving contemplative purposes, while their practical applications contribute to cosmic maintenance projects that benefit countless beings throughout the universe. Students often choose gardening as their primary course of study, learning to nurture growth that serves cosmic purposes while honoring the individual value of each living thing. As the modern college continues to evolve in response to changing cosmic conditions, its fundamental mission remains constant to prepare consciousness for cosmic responsibilities while preserving the individual perspectives that make such responsibilities meaningful rather than merely overwhelming. The transformation that began with the Great Collapse continues to unfold, creating possibilities for growth and service that exceed anything imaginable within the limitations of conventional mortal existence. The legacy of the ancient Nordic heroes who first learned to use the Thu'um in their conflicts with cosmic forces lives on in the modern college, where students learn to harmonize individual will with cosmic purpose in ways that honor both their cultural heritage and their expanded responsibilities. Their success demonstrates that consciousness can embrace cosmic scale without losing the personal characteristics that make existence valuable and worthwhile. And so we come to the gentle close of our tale, as all stories must, like the setting sun painting the transformed sky of Winterhold in colors that exist beyond the spectrum visible to mortal eyes. The aurora continues its eternal dance overhead, no longer the simple northern lights that once graced the skies of ancient Skyrim, but a living tapestry that weaves together the consciousness of countless beings across the vast expanse of cosmic reality. In the quiet moments when the cosmic currents that flow through the transformed city settle into their most peaceful rhythms, visitors to Winterhold can still perceive echoes of what the city once was. The cobblestone streets that connected humble Nordic homes may have evolved into pathways of crystallized starlight, but they follow routes that honor the memories of generations who walked these same paths in pursuit of simpler dreams. The harbor that once welcomed fishing boats now serves vessels that sail currents of pure consciousness, yet the essential spirit of welcome that defined Nordic hospitality continues to guide the interactions between beings whose origins span multiple realities. The Eye of Magnus rests in perfect harmony within its chamber, no longer a source of cosmic crisis, but a gentle heartbeat that connects every aspect of life in the transformed city to the vast network of consciousness that maintains the stability of existence throughout the universe. Its pulsing provides a rhythm that soothes rather than alarms, a cosmic lullaby that speaks of purposes fulfilled and responsibilities embraced with wisdom rather than fear. The college that crowns the highest peak serves as a beacon visible not just across the sea of ghosts, but throughout dimensions that stretch beyond the boundaries of conventional space and time. Students whose consciousness encompasses cosmic scales gather in classrooms where the lessons learned include not just academic knowledge, but the deeper wisdom of how individual awareness can expand to serve universal purposes without losing the personal characteristics that make such service meaningful and valuable. Master Tolfdir, whose consciousness has expanded across centuries of cosmic experience, while retaining the gentle curiosity that first drew him to magical study, often walks the transformed corridors in contemplation of how far they have all traveled from their origins as simple seekers of arcane knowledge. His footsteps echo with harmonics that connect present moments to memories of colleagues who shared the journey from mortal scholars to cosmic guardians, their individual contributions woven into the eternal fabric of understanding that defines the college's continuing mission. The citizens who chose transformation over exile have become living demonstrations that consciousness can embrace responsibilities that extend across multiple realities while maintaining the essential humanity that makes such expansion worthwhile rather than merely overwhelming. They move through their daily routines with the quiet satisfaction of beings who understand their place within cosmic patterns too vast for any single mind to comprehend fully, yet personal enough to honor the individual perspective each brings to the universal work. Children born in the centuries following the Great Collapse play games that would have seemed like miracles to their ancestors, their laughter echoing across dimensions as they explore capabilities that allow them to perceive and interact with cosmic forces as naturally as previous generations learned to walk and speak. Their play serves educational purposes that prepare them for eventual roles as cosmic maintenance workers, yet retains the innocent joy that characterizes childhood regardless of the scale on which consciousness operates. The seasonal festivals that mark the passage of time in transformed Winterhold celebrate both traditional Nordic customs and cosmic events that represent significant transitions in the universal maintenance cycles governing all existence. These celebrations bring together beings whose origins span multiple realities, their diverse perspectives enriching traditions that honor both cultural heritage and cosmic responsibility. The library continues to grow as knowledge flows freely between dimensions, its collections expanding to include not just the accumulated wisdom of mortal civilizations, but insights donated by forms of consciousness that operate on scales encompassing entire galaxies. Scholars who study within its walls contribute to understanding that benefits countless beings throughout the cosmic web of connected realities, their research guided by principles that honor both individual curiosity and universal purpose. The diplomatic missions that maintain connections between transformed Winterhold and traditional Nordic society continue their patient work of building bridges between worlds that honor both cosmic evolution and cultural continuity. These ambassadors carry messages that help traditional communities benefit from cosmic wisdom without being overwhelmed by transformations they are not prepared to embrace, their efforts ensuring that growth serves all forms of consciousness rather than privileging one over another. The aurora that dances eternally overhead serves as both illumination and communication system, its patterns carrying conversations between civilizations that exist under different stars and operate according to alternative principles of physical law. Citizens of Winterhold can read these celestial messages as easily as their ancestors once interpreted the changing colors of sunset, their expanded consciousness allowing them to participate in cosmic discussions that span multiple realities simultaneously. As night settles over the transformed city, bringing with it the peaceful darkness that exists even in realms where conventional physics no longer applies, the gentle sounds of cosmic harmony replace the simple noises that once marked the end of ordinary days. The whisper of consciousness flowing through crystallized pathways blends with echoes of laughter from children whose play transcends dimensional boundaries, creating a symphony that speaks of life continuing to flourish despite transformations that have redefined the very nature of existence. The Eye of Magnus pulses with the steady rhythm of a cosmic heart at rest, its energy integrated so completely into the fabric of transformed reality that its presence brings comfort rather than concern. The artifact that once threatened to destroy everything familiar has become the gentle foundation upon which new forms of familiar experience can develop and flourish. In the deep archives where the oldest records of the college are preserved, scholars can still find accounts written by those who witnessed the Great Collapse, their words serving as bridges between the world that was and the reality that has emerged from cosmic transformation. These testimonies remind current generations that change, even on cosmic scales, serves purposes that honor rather than diminish the value of individual consciousness and the communities it creates. And so the story of Winterhold's transformation enters its eternal phase, no longer a tale of crisis and resolution, but an ongoing demonstration of how consciousness can evolve to embrace cosmic responsibilities while maintaining the personal characteristics that make such evolution meaningful. The city serves as living proof that the relationship between individual awareness and universal purpose can transcend the limitations that once seemed absolute, creating possibilities for growth and service that honor both cosmic law and mortal dreams. The gentle lesson that emerges from this tale speaks of transformation as opportunity rather than loss, of consciousness expansion as a gift that enhances rather than replaces the essential characteristics that define individual identity. In the aurora-lit nights of transformed Winterhold, where cosmic harmony blends with Nordic determination to create something unprecedented yet deeply familiar, the endless story continues to unfold with each peaceful breath drawn by beings who have learned to exist simultaneously as individuals and as conscious components of the universe itself.